conversation about feminist enmities with the author of Feminism, and that's a whole mouthful. I'm gonna, oh wait, I should have brought my own copy, but anyway. Actually, let me grab one so that this can stay on display. I'm gonna read for a tiny bit, and then we'll have a conversation. You know the drill. I haven't spoken about this book for quite a few weeks. I did an intense amount of events in February, March, and April, and then took a little bit of a break, so I've got to remember what the hell I said. In fact, some of you may have read it by this point. Came out in February. All right. Feminists committed racist mistakes, and their feminisms reflected errors of judgment. This much. At last, we've been dragged kicking and screaming to recognize. But the culture still shows reluctance to contemplate the extent of some feminisms' deeper theoretic entwinements with fascism. What we need now is a bestiary of enemy feminisms to jolt us into understanding that a woman's cry for women's power is sometimes part and parcel of the oppressor's program. Even as we suffer loss in the short term, we can ultimately only gain as feminists when we accept that certain beloved old lines and lineages of feminism weren't just incidentally misogynist, but substantively so, that their core definitions were bourgeois irremediably, that their racism was non-excisable. What are our other options? Shall we attempt the bonkers task of calling in people with opposite aims to our own, decolonizing what is squarely a form of colonialism? Or shall we break up the house of feminism, that battered and beloved fortress where so many of us have not lived well, and dare to name some feminisms enemies? Contra the aggrieved cries from certain quarters that it can only ever be patriarchy that benefits when feminists criticize other feminists, I affirm with Gloria and Zaldúa that lines of affinity, not identity, must be drawn. Some feminisms are obstacles to gender freedom, and asking which side are you on is the most elemental level of political physics. The side of women doesn't exist. It never existed. Let's be brave and swallow our bitter medicine. Feminists across the political spectrum have taken pains to define their troops as chaste and untainted by lust, especially interracial lust, not to mention maternal, i.e. pure, straight, removed from the realm of productive work, and quote-unquote natural, that is not artificial, not femme, neither surgically nor chemically enhanced. Black feminisms have a better track record, but of course some black feminists too have been thoroughly ableist in this way, or whore-phobic, or anti-communist. All in all, a great deal of feminisms have imagined their central subject as hardworking, non-disabled, healthful, and prosthesis-free, these being the unspoken complements to a womanhood that is life-giving, or at least pro-family, economically independent, or at least aspiring, non-violent, or at least law-abiding, and quote-unquote self-respecting, not a body modifier or a bottom. All of this was feminism, not liberatory feminism, but feminism, in the sense that it contested a patriarchal constraint placed upon a certain group of women, no matter how few. Victorious aristofeminists proceed to co-engineer and enforce patriarchal or eugenic constraints for others, and they even expect generalized feminist support for their accessions. Is this worse than a hypothetical gentleman-only alternative domination? No, but nor is such equal opportunity inequality, such counter-revolutionary fairness, remotely what my team is fighting for. We need to be discerning about any given feminism precisely because feminism is so capacious that it comprises within itself its own enemies. I say this as a reluctant feminist killjoy because I belong to feminism. It is thanks to and despite people like Mary Wollstonecraft, both, that Feminism can be a force of reaction, even as it is an insurgent force that materially creates the right to the city, filling the streets with choreographies and chants denouncing cops, courts, dads, bosses, and the state. Feminism, in its best instances, is a burning prison, an insistence that life can be worth living and that every person's pleasure matters. It is, too, the practices that make life livable, wresting care free from the market, freely distributing bread, roses, and hormones, desegregating the generations, bailing mamas out of detention, disempowering rapists in kin networks, churches, and social centers, and expropriating golf courses in order to open spaces of erotic, not necessarily sexual, but also sexual, encounter. Feminism sometimes flashes an unlit pathway towards a world without whiteness or colonizers. In these moments, it's an insurrection halting family policing, forced gestating, and every other reproductive injustice. For many of us, feminism denotes the task of abolishing all organized scarcities from the private nuclear household to the nation. It's the deprivatization of love via the insurgency of mothers of every gender against the patriarchal institution of motherhood. It's the decoupling of survival from the wage, the destruction of markets, the ecological insistence on interspecies responsibility, the decarbonization of every megapole, and the communization of continent-wide architecture, waterways, seed banks, and libraries. It's a local proletarian strike against work, that always already gendered and stolen substance, otherwise called alienated labor. And it's a planetary revolution in values that prioritizes care over accumulation. It's a perfectly good name, too, for the horizon wherein work's myriad, precarious, abject, wageless, mad, incarcerated, and otherwise remaindered victims are avenged. As a revolutionary movement, feminism abolishes gender qua differential, while remaking genders qua lush, interesting, and pleasurable difference. Feminism, in other words, carves out space for autonomous formulations of gender-pending revolution, also known to some as the revolt of femmes against cisness, of sex workers against work. Feminism is black quantum womanism, junkie communism, multi-species reparations, a queer glitch in the matrix of the given. Feminism is necessarily central to any meaningful anti-fascism. But this does not mean that it is always anti-fascist or even non-fascist. We can't just bank on that. Rather, our task is to conspire towards a world where women, if that word still exists, will be horrible or not horrible. That's that where this chapter begins, the question of women not being horrible. But where counter-revolutionary feminism has been stripped of its capacity for violence, and even our feminism is happily obsolete. Okay. Thank you.
Did we turn it on? Or is this on? This on? Yes? Yeah, okay, good. So thank you for, this is really powerful, part, and this is a tiny piece of very beginning of the book. I am really happy to be invited to, have a conversation with you here today. I've read, I've also heard, previous books, Abolish the Family and Full Service Now. I just really respect that work, and then this came out, and then I just read it right away, and I'm starting to already forget. So I'm like, oh my God, I need to speak about this in May. But I think and also in the beginning you talked about how some sex worker activists have tried to be generous with people who are trying to put us in prison, put us into forced treatment programs, involuntary programs and things like that, and try to understand where they're coming from, try to educate them and all that. And this book really points out that, like you said at the very beginning of where you read it, that people are not just incidentally racist. They're not just incidentally, oppressive in some other way, but there's actually a tradition of that, kind of counter, just counter-revolutionary movement and tradition and threat within the feminism, and that is, and toward the end, the very end, you combine that threats into, the idea of ceaseless along with like whiteness and capitalism and how that connects together. So that's like I feel like overall thing of that. I think that when people who do things that's harmful in the name of feminism, like if they are all like Sarah Palin, who's transparently not a feminist and who's just using the word, I'm better feminist than feminist because I do this, then that would be so much easier. We can just say like feminists are actually much better than that. But that's not true. Like we have people like J.K. Rowling or Hillary Clinton or Sheryl Sandberg who are feminists in some way, right? And they connect to the tradition of kind of like a, the kind of feminism that we see as anti-liberatory feminism, right? And so it's not so easy. They're not all Sarah Palin. They're actually, they're actually Kamala Harris. I don't know how many of you have to like vote for a prosecutor instead of like convicted felon. I want to support convicted felon, but not in this particular case, right? So, yes. So, anyway, so I think that, and I feel like that it's important to how we can make a distinction between this kind of incidental mistakes that we all make. We all participate in some kind of racism, other ways that are harmful to other people, that are oppressive, and then we want to be generous. We want to, call them in instead of calling them out when it's possible and when it's not counterproductive, right? So, and you wrote that how the liberatory feminist tradition is also far from being free from the schisms, missteps, contradiction, exclusions, right? Even within, even though the black feminism has inaugurated American, like white feminism against so much of like a horror that happens in, some other form of feminism, and yet like there are sometimes issues of exclusions, and so how do we make distinction between, and we still have to address those harms even if they are not part of this like a larger, and so how do we address them and how do we distinguish them from the enemy feminism, people who actually want to like eliminate us, who want to put us in prison, and who want to do that, and how can we tell the difference, where to draw the line, and are those lines defensible, right?
Yeah. Thanks. That's the core of the book. Yeah. That's so. If I was really attempting to answer that in detail, I would be trying to create a manual based on a notion of a purity that would actually be, repeating the purgative and purity-oriented ideologies of the enemy feminisms I'm looking at, right? It would have been a mistake to try and tell readers or decide for myself where exactly is that line, and the line won't move, and we can, and it's a question of here's a list. It's an encyclopedia of individual feminists who are beyond the pale. That's really not what it is, unfortunately. It's a much different kind of gesture, right? It's insisting that feminism is the house that for me, and I accept that some people don't actually feel this way, and I think that's valid, but I live here, right? And I'm insisting that I stay, that we stay, right? And fight it out. That's part of it, being a love letter to feminism, right? It's also making a stronger statement than some of the statements that have been made about white feminism. I believe it's a slightly different kind of intervention, because it's insisting that there are sort of two wolves inside feminist history, and it's not just a question of differences of opinion and variations on a theme, but it's seriously antagonistic notions of what it means to liberate people from patriarchy, right? And in a sense, I bring up Wollstonecraft early on, but not because I put her in the enemy bin, but because she's one starting point we are given for the Anglophone, Western, colonial, bourgeois feminist tradition. And she's full of interesting things, right? Really valuable things in there. And she thinks feminism, which she doesn't have the word for yet, right? Because it gets invented a couple of decades later, is the elevation of mother to a position of enlightenment, rationality, and proprietary ownership vis-a-vis the children in the private nuclear household, who are then also avatars of the nation's future and therefore imperial futurity. So not everything has to change about the world in order for feminism to succeed. Just empower mother, educate mother, and empire will, and it's cunning of her, she's like, gentlemen, don't worry, feminism isn't going to fuck up the British Empire. Au contraire, it's like, it's going to save it. But, a few decades later, actually a few years later, the word feminism gets invented by a really kinky, strange French person who says that feminism is the complete opposite of that, right? It is the insurgency of children and women against the enclosure of care in the private nuclear home. It's family abolition. So it's no secret which of these two wolves I favor, right? I sort of am insisting on this duality in feminism. I don't think we can get rid of it. If you want to say that, the literal fascists who are in the canonical, like mainstream feminist tradition, legacy, are not really feminists because they are racist and because they literally, in some cases, were friends with Adolf Hitler. Sorry, I mean, those are the far out. But, I don't actually have to use the most extreme examples to make this case, right? If you want to say that feminists who are committed racists are not really feminists, because that's the move, right? I mean, if you Google the phrase "not real feminists" or "not really feminism," hundreds of thousands of results, right? TERFs, not really feminists, right? Etc. That's the thing we say. I get why we say it. It just doesn't work because you don't. If we do that, then you don't get to keep Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You don't get to keep Mary Wollstonecraft. She was saying that the oppression of the bourgeois English wife is worse than the oppression of the African slave. And then of course people want to say things are of their time, fine, but she was writing in the middle of the Haitian Revolution. Of course there were maroon feminisms, concurrent to her claims, right? So inside feminism there's an undercommons, there's a movement from below, to achieve liberation for all, and there is a movement that seeks securitization for women. And so these are quite incompatible notions of what it is to fight for women, and what woman is, and what woman needs. They're not compatible, they are enemies, right? And I think we just have to deal with that. We just do, and there are certainly, missteps, schisms, exclusions, warts on our side, of course. There's no, in fact, a commitment to a sort of impurity and an openness to the mutant kin that inherit, our legacies along with us. That the fact that basically, Wollstonecraft is a sort of, mutant family member. If you live in the house of feminism, that's part of what I'm inviting us to wrestle with. And enmity cuts across kinship, That's the kind of move I'm trying to make, where I'm inviting us to be very thoughtful about the importance of not treating people as disposable because they've made ideological errors or whatever, But there are also differing projects that are genuinely like echt feminism, and we need to learn how to establish and recognize that, and then as collectives, like you started with the I tell this story about Carol Lee, who, you know, the legendary sex worker liberationist, sitting down with a friend of hers who used to be in prostitution with her and who is now working with the local jails to put sex workers in, you know, in prison for even longer, right? And there's this incredible account in Scarlet Harlot of this, you know, feminist exchange where Carol Lee is so committed to the idea of a sisterhood of the sluts and the good girls, as she puts it, and the cops, the police women, and the prostitutes, and it is just so obviously doomed. You know, it is so wrong. And I think, you know, with great reverence and respect for Carol Lee, I think energy is wasted there. You know, I think an anti-fascist line can be drawn, you know. And I mean, some of us have been calling the trans-exclusionary radical feminist formation, you know, on TERF Island, where I sound like I come from, alas, you know, fascist, right? I mean, it, you know, people will, you know, it's this kind of premature anti-fascism that the left is sort of fated to embody sometimes, right? It's like you're called hysterical for calling this shit fascist 15 years ago, but it, you know, here we are, like, you know, J.K. Rowling literally applauding the executive order, quote unquote, defending women against gender ideology extremism, right? And Posey Parker, the sort of let women speak, although she disavows feminism. She calls herself a TERF, but not a feminist. Don't really know how that works, but anyway.
She came to Tacoma to do like a TERF coma protest or something, and there were a bunch of like high school students surrounded them and like, you know, yelling at them.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, this was a bit long-winded. Is the line defensible? I think it is one way to revivify a sort of erotics of anti-fascist feminism in order to give oneself, I mean, I don't know, you know, permission, really, to say that J.K. Rowling is a fascist. I mean, I'm not sure people in this room need that permission or whatever. But you know, what matters is not convincing you that she has some, you know, lineage within women's liberation. You know, it's in her case, it's not the strongest kind of claim, you know, to belonging to movement, but it's there. There are some figures, you know, who sadly really, you know, they have a feminist pedigree and they're in this camp, right? Okay. You know, one of the heartening things about looking at history, and this is why the book has this historicizing method. I mean, I hope that it's a theoretic intervention with a historicizing method, because anti-fascists can actually gain and get and you know, there's hope and lessons, you know, from telling stories from the past. We've actually swallowed, I think, many of us, at least in my milieus, a story about the so-called second wave that is just false. And so, you know, the idea that transphobia was majoritarian in feminism, it's just a lie, actually, and you can see this very easily. You know, in 1973, the issue of Lesbian Tide, the women's liberation movement periodical, that is doing the post-mortem on the West Coast Lesbian Conference, where, you know, this one of my least favorite human beings, Robin Morgan, really sort of ruined by, you know, whipping up a lynch mob against Beth Elliott, the folk singer and transsexual sort of conference organizer. Anyway, it's a very famous story. But, you know, this story about how a trans woman was, you know, almost lynched at the West Coast Lesbian Conference of 1973 is kind of held up as this, I mean, yes, a very, very horrible moment. But what I think people don't quite appreciate is how minoritarian the attackers were. And in the minutes of what people were saying in that moment, people are saying, and this is 1973, I can't believe we are litigating whether trans women are women. I thought we resolved this years ago. This is so boring. Of course, Beth is our sister. We can't see her as a man. What the fuck? You know, get this fascist out of our space. I mean, Robin Morgan, the celebrity poet and keynote, right? And so, you know, of all the things in the magazine, everyone is calling Robin Morgan a Nazi. Apart from the Robin Morgan herself, whose speech is printed, but it's printed in very small font. Anyway, I'm just saying. Like,
yes, I mean locally, like I think that people may be familiar with like what Susan Stryker was written about this trans woman in Seattle who committed suicide in 1991, Elizabeth Stima, and she wrote based on some like erroneous, just not very good reporting about that case, and how that this trans woman she was volunteering at the Lesbian Research Center, and how she was like totally marginalized and forced to do things that's really humiliating, and then and just hated by the community. And I actually dug around in all the Lesbian Research Center and Bisexual Women's Network of Seattle, records from the time, and then found like she actually was loved and supported by the community. I mean, of course, like there were haters out there, and then I'm not denying that may have contributed to her, taking her own life. But like the reality is actually like there's it was a small minority who really hated her, and mostly this whole controversy was not even about trans women. It was about BDSM, and there was the BDSM workshop at the Lesbian Research Center that some people really didn't like, and then so like if you actually read the real history of it, I find out that actually they were not so universally hateful. There were lots of support for trans women at the time in the Seattle lesbian community, Seattle queer women's community. So that's like a local example of that. How that we may be like mistelling history if we think that this the anti-trans feminism or anti-trans lesbianism was like mainstream, which it wasn't.
Yeah. Totally.
Like it may be more mainstream now than than at the time.
No, I mean the thing is, however, one cannot always point in an archive to the anti-fascist or liberatory undercommons feminism. Sometimes you can only sort of see its traces in the enemy feminism as a sort of reaction formation against it, but you can sort of, this is a sort of Saidiya Hartman sort of point really about a kind of speculative fabulation type archive that we can at least in some cases practice a kind of indignation, I would say, about what has been stripped or erased or purposively memory holed and taken out of the story of feminism, the ancestors that we have not been bequeathed, because we've been told that the second wave is a bunch of Robin Morgans exclusively, or going back further, and here it gets more hazy, that the first wave was a bunch of Emmeline Pankhursts when there were, anti-fascist Sylvias around as well. I mean, Sylvia's obviously in the archive. The Pankhurst family has this very, very strange sort of combination of pro-imperialists and anarcho-communists. But the suffragettes in the UK context, and by that I mean very specifically the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which was a very cult-like, almost paramilitary organization. Actually, it's not usually referred to that way, but over here in the US, suffragists were shocked by the terrorist tactics of the suffragettes in the UK. And if you're educated in a sort of European middle-class progressive girlhood, I don't know about here so much, but I was taught that there was some window pane smashing, and there was this hunger strike thing and forced feeding in prisons, and this is what suffragettes did. Of course, not only are all the other organizations left out, right? There's a lot of other suffragist organizations who thought that the WSPU was a bit weird because it was really authoritarian, very, very hierarchical. But it's a complex story, this story, because it wasn't just window smashing, it was bombing. I don't know if people here are aware that the WSPU bombed the shit out of England between 1908 and 1913. There were nitroglycerin bombs, incendiary devices. I mean, it was as many bombs as the IRA detonated in 1939 to 1940. It's just that then the Great War began, and everybody had other things to focus on. And after the war, when they wrote the history of the WSPU, they literally, quote, left out the bombs. This is like a letter, you know, should we leave out the bombs? Yeah. let's leave them out. And I mean, so I mean, I'm not against bombing things necessarily. I'm just interested in how a bunch of adventuring middle-class women fighting for the vote, who then achieved it at the end of the First World War, which they weren't calling the First World War at that point because they didn't know there would be a second one.
Great war.
Yeah. You know, then basically we're like, that's fine, that's enough. We've got suffrage for property owning ladies over 30. That's fine. That's what we are. Moving right along. Sorry. I mean, there's a whole movement to the left of the WSPU. But then many ex-suffragettes become fascists in the interwar period. And this is something that liberal historiography is very weird about. Like liberal feminists who, you know, because do you know that the suffragette colours, the purple, white, and green, on social media, this means TERF now. You know, in the UK, if you have those colours in your bio, it means you're basically focused on making trans children and trans women miserable / extinct. There's this anniversary of the women's, you know, social and political union victory that has been sort of once again. Oh, this was a few years ago, obviously, but you know, it was whitewashed to shit. You know, it was really like once again the bombs were left out, shall we say, and the fact that many of the veterans joined the British Union of Fascists. When it was founded in the early 30s, is also completely glossed over. And there is a book that exists called Feminine Fascism by someone called Julie Gottlieb, who really epitomizes the approach. And it's like, okay, I, Julie Gottlieb, liberal feminist, am going to have a look at this very, very scary topic, which is that some suffragettes became card-carrying Nazis. Now, before I begin, let's just state the obvious. There can be no such thing as a feminist fascist. Okay? 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 Great. Great. Now, let us proceed. Well, reassuringly, many suffragettes did not join the British Union of Fascists. And the word reassuringly happens like every 7 pages. It's like... Anyway, so the point is, sorry, that was very disrespectful, but it is a really bizarre, it's a very, you feel insane reading it, because you're like, are we going to learn anything? Ever? I'm waiting. She's just like, this is really scary. I hate this. But you know what ends up happening is something very unfeminist, which is that she gives all of the credit for history and action and responsibility for anything to the British Union of Fascists men. And she says, oh, they steal the energy of the women. They wanted to co-opt, they wanted to steal the fire of the suffragettes and absorb that. And it's like, do women do things in your notion of history? And I'm serious about this. If you read Andrea Dworkin's extraordinarily evil final book, or maybe it's not her quite final, it's like her penultimate book, Scapegoat, it basically says that women have no responsibility for history whatsoever. One day, women will enter history, and then maybe we can talk. And this is like radical feminism, you know? And I just, wow. Sorry, I swear I'm not just, well, I'm being polemical, but yeah.
And that to the connection to the Zionist feminism that, you know.
Yes, please, let's. The Zionist feminism thing, yes.
That you know, her toward her end of her, you know, life.
Yeah, I have a piece coming out in 2 days. We'll see what the Dworkin revivalists of today make of it. I think it's kind of important in this moment where we have actually been told around the planet that some genocides are feminist, right? That in fact, you know, it's important to annihilate Gaza because of sexual violence committed against Israeli women. You know, that we notice that certain things that are once again popular being reissued, such as, you know, Dworkin's early to middle career over pornography and right-wing women and women, you know, whatever the ones that they're into. I don't know which ones they've republished, but there is a sort of strange 6-year long now Dworkin revival, and I have just been, you know, widening my eyes for 6 years, wishing that some other, you know, second waver such as Amber Hollowell or Pat Parker or, you know, Joan Nessel or you know, there's so many. And you've just finished reading the autobiography of Marsha P. Johnson by Tourmaline. You know, there are so many.
Amazing.
Yeah, but for some reason we're reviving Dworkin. Okay, well perhaps we should think about the fact that the trajectory of her cultural feminism was a statement in Scapegoat, this book from 2000 that she wrote, that looks at the Shoah and then looks at the Nakba, and is constantly, because she is smart enough to not, you know, completely flinch from this, you know, she sees the analogy. She's a very analogistic thinker, much like Wollstonecraft was saying, you know, the wife is actually the slave we should have been worried about this whole time, a worse, an even more oppressed slave. She's always sort of, she in fact says the same thing. There is a remarkably long lineage of women's thinkers saying, you know, woman is the N-word of the world, like Yoko Ono said in 1968. In a way, Wollstonecraft said it and Dworkin said it, and, you know, in a way I think we've been inculcated into thinking it in the West quite a lot. But sorry, to stop parenthesizing. Dworkin seriously proposes in the one book she has that's the most scholarly, the most referenced, and the longest, that what women need to do is to do Israel for women, right? And she says this on the back of a book that looks very deeply at the violence of Zionism. What she does is quite chilling in that sense, because she is willing to say, yeah, this is very, very violent. And in the end, it is justified in the way that a woman killing her rapist is justified. Now, we're in a moment where spokespeople for the Zionist entity are calling Hamas a rape regime, you know? And I have no real doubt in my heart about where Dworkin would be standing in this moment when it comes to the genocide of Palestinians ongoing right now. But what I do think is important to identify is structures of thought that tend towards this fascistic purity, this innocence for a people, right? Which in feminist terms can actually be a sort of female cultural nationalism or a sort of a female sexual separatism. This is one of the strands in our legacy, right? That we inherit. It's one of our mutant kin.
Innocence and all that things that are available to certain women, and I think that goes into like toward the end of the book, like, you know, the last part is talking about the feminism against cisness, and there's actually a book titled that, you know, about transfeminist theory and, you know, anthology, and obviously like when we call for feminism against cisness, we're not just talking about cisness in terms of like somebody who's not trans, so like even that, you know, privileging cis people and cis bodies over trans people, it's much bigger than that, because you know, it's something that describes the kind of like womanhood that's defined and defended and that's made available to certain women and not to the other women and other people. Right?
Absolutely.
So I'd like to hear like what the cisness means in that context.
Yeah, the anthology Emmy just mentioned is edited by Emma Heaney. Emma Heaney's book, This Watery Place, is also forthcoming next year, and her previous book, The New Woman, is also in this theorization of cisness that provincializes cisness. You know, really turns on its head the assumption that cisness somehow exists and that women are cis before somehow transness comes along and disrupts this. This is not the way that she proposes Marxist feminism should operate. She says that cisness is feminism's counter-revolution, because what cisness is the naturalization of assigned sex. it's baked, it's part of the coloniality of gender, it's part of the imposition of an ontology of sex onto bodies. And so, this is a really important thing for our times because we're facing, a fascist moment that has a significant feminist face, right? I know this sounds intense, but as Emmy was saying, that the statement is stronger. I'm saying that racism, I'm not the first to say this, but racism is sometimes a patriarchal form of feminism, or the fascism is one of feminism's forms of appearance. That we need to understand that in history, there has been this ontological approach to womanhood, that is actually a counter-revolutionary gesture against a feminist undercommons that doesn't need to know how to define a woman. The MAGA people will try and gotcha you all day with, define woman then. No, there should be no hesitation or confusion among our ranks, if you like, about this. Just decline. That, feminism has proceeded beautifully, without a definition of women. You do not need it. Feminism does not need it to proceed. Feminism is in fact doing pretty good. It's actually everywhere, right? There are many lamentations from a certain kind of quarter of the left about the shitness and cringeness of feminism in the now, and this is just because, the speaker is not seeing herself and her historical notions of what feminism is in the world around her. But in fact, abolition feminism, trans feminism, sex worker-led feminism, junkie communism, it's actually everywhere. And the revolution of trans kids, right? The huge threat to cis heteropatriarchy and capitalist settler colonial futurity, the bodily autonomy and self-knowledge and deprivatizing horizon of trans children are opposing that's clearly the feminism of our moment in a significant way, right? I just realized that we've talked for almost an hour, Emmy, and we were supposed to have a conversation with the rest of the room.
How long? I thought it would go for an hour and a half or just hour?
I think they said an hour.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you like to ask some questions?
Yeah.